For the second example, for the cylindrical components, this is still a two-dimensional problem. So ang difference lang ani is instead of finding the magnitude of velocity and acceleration, ang atong gipangita is ang angular velocity or theta dot and the angular acceleration na theta double dot. So due to the rotation of the forked rod, the ball in the figure travels around the slotted path, a portion of which is in the shape of a cardioid, which has an equation of r is equal to 0.5 times 1 minus cosine theta. So this one is the fork rod. So muna to ang ball na nag-travel around the slotted path, and it forms, when the ball is traveling around the slotted path, it forms a shape of a cardioid. So a cardioid is actually a heart shape. So this is the equation of our cardioid. Nato. Naka-polar coordinates na siya. Where theta is in radians, and if the ball's velocity is 4 feet per second and its acceleration is 30 feet per second squared, at the instant of the angle is equal to 180 degrees, what we need to determine are the angular velocity theta dot and the angular acceleration na theta double dot of the fork. So that would be 4 for the angular velocity and 18 for the angular acceleration. So the same lang gihapon aning sa second example, the same equations, the same procedure. So this one, di ba, for coordinate system nato, mao na tong coordinate system, we establish first the coordinate system first. We know kung unsay klaseng coordinate system ang gigamit. So that is a polar coordinate since that is two-dimensional. Take note, two-dimensional, that is the polar coordinates. So that is r and theta. And for the angular velocity, we identify the angular velocity based from the equation sa velocity nato. So if we write down the equation of the magnitudes of velocity, so ang equation sa magnitudes of velocity is equal to the square root of vr squared plus v theta squared. Okay? So ang vr nato was r dot and v theta is equal to r theta dot. So manuman ang equation sa magnitude sa velocity ato gigamit, kinaman siya naman diri ang theta dot or angular velocity. So we can use this to determine the value of the angular velocity. And once we know already the values of r and r dot, we can now determine the value of the angular velocity. Ang v nato, ang magnitude of velocity is the 4 feet per second. Take note, ang 4 feet per second nato is at the instant na ang angle is 180 degrees. Okay, so at an angle na 180 degrees, pag move sa ball at an angle na 180 degrees, the velocity at that instant is 4 feet per second. So what we will do first is we determine the first derivative of r. So that would be, the r is the equation of the cardioid. So that is 0.5 times 1 cosine theta. So we just only determine its first derivative. So like what I mentioned, you don't substitute directly the angle 180 degrees because 180 degrees is not a variable. That is a constant value. I mean, an angle theta rather is an instant, murag a specific value mismo of an instant angle sa to ang ball. So the equation sa R is the equation sa R is at any angle ni siya. So atong ma-determine na first derivative sa R is at any angle pod mismo. So pag substitute sa angle 180 degrees, ang value sa R, mao na ang value sa R nato at the instant na ang angle is 180 degrees. So we just determine the first derivative of this equation. So that is 0.5 minus 0.5 cosine theta. Okay, so actually there are many ways for you to differentiate this equation. So ako gibuhat, i-distribute sa nakang 0.5. So ang first derivative, r dot, integration lang nako using a dot notation, r dot. So this is 0 minus 0.5 times the derivative of cosine, that is a negative sine theta, times the derivative of theta, theta dot. Okay? Am I correct? Ang derivative sa cosine is negative sine. Ang derivative sa cosine is negative sine. Tama ba? Just to make sure kung tama ba akong answer. Okay. So, just to simplify this one, so negative 0.5 times negative sine theta, may muna siyang positive. So, 0.5 sine theta times theta dot. So, at an angle na 180 degrees, or at this instant, we determine the values of R. So that would be 0.5 times 1 minus cosine 180 degrees. So pila tong R ana? So what's the value of R nato? And the R dot is 0.5 sine 180 degrees, then theta dot. Ang theta dot or angular velocity is the unknown. So what takabaloon sa ngiyahang value? Mao na itong i-determine later on. So what's the value of R? Kaning 0.5 times 1 minus cosine 180 degrees. What's the value nato? One. So that is 1. Kasi gamit na unit, feet. So 1 feet. Okay, naka-feet maning R nato. So 1 feet. How about the R dot? Pila maning 0.5 times sine 180 degrees. That is 0. So technically, the first derivative of r is a 0 value. So 0 feet per 0 foot per second. So that is the derivative, the value of the first derivative sa r, or the r dot. So we have the values of r and r dot. So we substitute on our equation. So just a continuation. So ang VR nato is r dot. So that is 0. V theta is 1 times theta dot. So that is theta dot. Kay mama na itong gipangita ang angular velocity or theta dot. So the equation sa magnitude of velocity is VR squared plus V theta squared. And ang velocity at the instant ng angle is 180 degrees is 4. So that would be 4 is equal to 0 squared plus theta dot squared. So since 0 naman sa first term and theta dot squared, so pag square root theta dot naman siya, so ang angular velocity nato would be equal to 4 radians per second. So that is our angular velocity of this problem. At the instant ng angle is 180 degrees. So take note ha, it depends on the angle. So kung 90 ba siya, kung 70, 65, 45, it will have a different angular velocity. So for this one, ang 4 radians per second, this is the angular velocity at the instant ng angle is 180 degrees. So just a continuation, for the angular acceleration, so sa angular acceleration, we use the equation sa magnitude sa acceleration. So that is AR squared plus A theta squared, where the AR is R double dot minus R theta dot squared, and A theta is equal to R theta dot plus 2R dot theta dot. So I forgot the theta double dot ni. So this is the equivalent equation. This is the equation rather sa radial and transverse component. So mana to ang gigamit sa previous example. So acceleration atong gigamit kay tungod nadri ang theta double dot or the angular acceleration kani. So na naman kay other time derivatives ang R dot na solve nato kanina, ang theta dot mo lang 4. So ang atong problemahon is kaning R double dot. Wata kabalon sa equation or value ani. So if we go back, diba ang iyang original equation was 0.5, 1 minus cosine theta. And ang iyahang first derivative was 0.5 sine theta times the theta dot. Tao ba kung koan? Yes, 0.5 times sine theta times theta dot. Ano yung first derivative? So, pag second derivative, take note, these two are different entities or different terms. So, we can use the product rule again. So, u sine theta and du is cosine theta. Derivative sa sine theta is cosine theta times the derivative of theta, that is theta dot, and v is theta dot, and derivative sa v is theta double dot. So that is the derivatives and the kaning u and v na gamiton nato to perform product rule. So you can now determine the second derivative sa r or the r double dot. So kung product rule, u dv plus v du, so u is sine, and igawas ang 0.5 times dv is theta double dot or the angular velocity plus v is theta dot and du is cosine theta times theta dot. So we just only simplify this. Distribute ang 0.5. Be careful pag distribute sa value. Ayaw kalimot ang 0.5 sa last term. So, na 0.5 dire. Cosine theta. Then, i-combine ang duwa na theta dot. Duwa ka theta dot. So, theta dot. So, that is theta dot squared. So, you just only substitute the values sa angle theta and the angular velocity na theta dot. Okay? So, at the angle theta na 180 degrees and also the angular velocity na gisolve nato kanina was 4 radians per second. So, ang r double dot, that would be 0.5 sine 180 degrees theta double dot plus 0.5 times cosine 180 degrees times 4 squared. Actually, the sine 180 degrees is 0. Okay, so the first term would be a 0. So, pila man atong second term. So, actually, this is dali naman ko ang 180 degrees pag-determine sa iyahang trigonometric value sa 180 degrees. So, ang cosine 180 degrees is 1, if I'm not mistaken. So, 1 ni cosine 180 degrees times 0.5, so 0.5 times 4 squared, so 16. So 16 times 0.5 is cosine 180 degrees. Pilang cosine 180 degrees? Pa-check kung 1 ba. Or negative 1. So, negative 1 times 0.5, negative 0.5 times 4 squared, that is 16. So, negative 8 feet per second squared. So, nanatay r double dot, negative 8 feet per second squared. If you notice, di ba, ang r nato r was 1 foot. Ang r dot is 0 feet per second. And ang r double dot is negative 8 feet per second squared. If you analyze the value at the instant na 180 degrees, at the angle na 180 degrees, the first derivative sa r, which is the r dot, which is a velocity, is a zero, which means walay speed, nag-stop, or approaching to stop ang kaning iyahang velocity. And pag abot sa r double dot, nahimo na siyang negative, meaning nag-decelerate. Diba? If you notice on the values, so the same lang gyapon sa kanang sa car. Kung approaching to stop ang car, or it will turns to zero ang speed sa car, so the acceleration will be decelerating, or it will be a negative. So mo na ang reason why we need to make sure na tama to ang value based on analysis. So when we analyze, tama to ang value na negative 8. Kay kailangan nag-decelerate. Kay base man sa to ang first derivative sa r, na r dot, which the value is 0. So ang ato ang second derivative, or the r double dot, would be a negative value. So mao na negative 8 feet per second squared. So we can now substitute here sa to ang equation. So just a continuation, AR nato was r double dot minus r theta dot squared. So that was negative 8 minus 1 times 4 squared. And ang A theta was r theta double dot plus 2 r dot theta dot. So this is 1 as isang theta double dot, or the angular acceleration, kay unknown pa man siya, plus 2 times 0 times 4. So pila man itong AR? Kaling sa first one. Kaling negative 8 minus 1 times 4 squared. What's the value? Negative 24. Negative 24 feet per second squared. Ang dire, 0 naman ni, so this would be equal to theta double dot, which mo na to ang determine later on. So, from the equation sa magnitude sa acceleration, that is A is equal to AR squared plus A theta squared. So, ang acceleration at the instant ng angle is 180 degrees. That is 30. So, that would be 30 is equal to the square root of negative 24 squared plus theta double dot squared. So, what we will do here, para kuan is i-squared nato para ma-cancel out si radical sign. So that would be 900. 30 squared is 900. Is equal to, pila man ang 24 squared? Ang negative 24 squared. What's the value of 24 squared? 576 plus theta double dot squared. So transpose ang 576 to the other side. So that would be 900 minus 576. So what would be the value sa 900 minus 576 nato? 324. Then we can now determine the angular acceleration by square root both side. So ang atong angular acceleration or theta double dot is equal to 18 feet per second squared. Sorry, not feet because angle man, so 18 radians per second squared. So this is your angular acceleration that is 18 radians per second. So after we square root both sides, we apply square root sa both sides sa itong equation, we can get the value of our angular acceleration. So just a recap, the angular velocity was 4 radians per second, and the angular acceleration was 18 radians per second squared. And if we check if our answer is correct, so 4 radians per second and 18 radians per second squared. So that is your angular velocity and angular acceleration. Okay? So, basta when you solve problems for cylindrical components, you just basically familiarize the equation. Okay? You just take note unsa ang equation sa VR, V theta, AR, and A theta. And then ang magnitude is we just use the Pythagorean theorem. So that is basically how you familiarize the equations for the cylindrical components. So do you have any question on the second example so far? Do you have any questions or clarification?